reflect on the evolution of sugar from the old world to the new world and how sugar became integrated into our lives. And I take a very broad history dive that takes you on this timeline. So let's get started. I don't want to go through this, I only have limited time, but basically this is going to go through how it became integrated, how sugarcane was harvested, how it was refined, what were the climate conditions, the innovations, and what impacts it had on cuisine and how it was implemented into societies, and how sugar was viewed and used, also the labor involved, and we'll also explore the dark histories of such. Oh, what's going on here? Okay, so give you a brief origin. So sugarcane, what is going on? It's cracking out. Okay, sugarcane was first discovered by the native people of Papua New Guinea at around 9,000 BC. It was considered an excellent source of carbohydrates and energy. Gosh, I don't know what's going on.
On your clicker, there may be a button you're hitting that turns off the
Oh, it's worth exploring. Essentially, it became part of their diets. People found this to also be an excellent resource for pigs and fattening them for later human consumption. For how it's grown or how sugar is grown in conjunction with the climate, basically it requires a hot and humid tropical climate, roughly 81 to 100 degrees, year-round rainfall. The rain requirement for optimal sugarcane growth is between 1,100 to 1,500 millimeters. It takes around 12 months to harvest sugar, and after it's been harvested, the roots are essentially pulled out from the soil and replanted in the ground for the next harvest. So sugar eventually left the Papua New Guinea islands roughly at 1100 BC, and it was introduced to India and Southeast Asia, more particularly with sugar in ancient India. The innovations that were particularly fascinating, during the Gupta dynasty in 350 AD, they were the first to develop a method in crystallizing sugar, they're one of the first, through a process of grinding or pounding the cane to extract its juice, to be later boiled until it was super saturated and forming the rock crystals that we now recognize today. So for the remaining, molasses, which is for the ones that weren't formed into rock sugar, was developed into a dark syrupy texture that we can now buy from stores into large jars and so on and so forth. The labor of ancient India with sugar was a mix of skilled workers, generally people who were learning for skilled workers, for religious purposes, apprenticeship, prisoners who were paying off war, or prisoners of war, people that were paying off debts. So sugarcane in ancient India was considered for its medicinal, or revered for its medicinal and religious purposes. So according to primary sources, it was according to such, it was attributed to curing jaundice, possessing anti-allergic properties, rich in minerals, improving the digestion and immunity, cleansing the lungs and bladder, purifying the blood, providing energy, very contrasting to how we view sugar today, which is considered poison to a lot of people. For religious purposes, it was used by holy men to provide strength during their austerities, which is another word for prayer. So Siddhartha Gautama was known as being born of sugarcane since his ancestry traced back, and as a matter of fact, in the process of achieving enlightenment, he was adorned by sugarcane, which I thought was pretty fascinating. So sugar in the Middle East, it was first introduced through King Darius in 510 BC. As a matter of fact, the Persian Empire, thanks to my professor for introducing me this primary source, they are the first recorded empire of discovering the process of turning sugar into rock crystals. But in India and Persia had not, that was very conflicting, the information I had before. It's doing it again. With that being said, generally sugar, before sugar, it was generally honey and dates that was the replacement of that sugar or that sweet craving. So when King Darius came across sugar when he invaded India, he recalled it as the reed which gives honey without bees. I'm not touching it. This is crazy. Improved sugar. So in the Middle East, they established sugar mills, plantations across the Mediterranean and Fertile Crescent, and they improved refining techniques, pressing, irrigation, agricultural techniques. This was more specifically with Arabia once they had invaded Persia back in 641 AD, and they kind of broke the secret because before Persia was known as this empire that once they got a hold of sugar, they kept it a closed secret, they kept it within doors, they didn't want this technology or sharing this information to anybody. So when the Arabs came in, they took this refining technologies and decided and turned it into sugar factories that were spread across the Mediterranean. Earliest form of desserts like cakes, cookies, and fried dough treats originated from the Middle East. Your favorite, or one of your favorite, like cakes, dough treats, or the cheese Danish actually originated or was inspired from the Middle East, roughly around 11th century, 10th century-ish, from an Islamic cookbook that I'd found. So sugar in medieval Europe finally been introduced after the Crusades, and once it was introduced, there was very scarce amounts, and it was considered a luxury spice consumed by generally wealthy Europeans. It was used primarily for medicinal purposes. That was sold by pharmacists, and that's where that Mary Poppins saying is 1 spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down, and that was because medicine generally has this disgusting foul taste, so sugar would kind of help people out. Just gobble it up, you're good to go. So with that being said, they also, what was interesting about this is that the people of the medieval Europe, if they believed that it cured the sick, that it might be good for the healthy. So like the Indians or the people of India, there was a correlation to it being healthy and having medicinal properties. Dessert creation, such as through the sugar integrated into Europe, was custards, wafers, jellies, apple pie, gingerbread, and so on. Sugar cultivation problems and solutions. So as there was sugar factories in the the Mediterranean and the Middle East, there was problems because the scarce amounts led to increased prices, and it wasn't an easy commodity to come across, and it was very expensive, roughly $400, or I think it was $380 per kilo for sugar back then, equating from what it was to kind of coincide with the currency. Essentially, the Genoans and the Venetians began relying on India to trade sugar cane and refining it instead rather than growing it. And this is particularly because sugar tends to grow between 81 and 100 degrees. 70, it starts to slowly grow, and then 50, it stops altogether. So the climate conditions were absolutely not ideal whatsoever. During this time, the Portuguese began first sugar plantation system on the, Madeira Island with African slave labor. They were the first African slave labor force that was used for the cultivation of sugar. So the sugar's arrival in the New World, or the Americas. Christopher Columbus discovers the Americas, as we all know, in 1492. Oh my gosh. Yeah, this is not it. 1492, and it was completely reminiscent of Papua New Guinea. Perfect climate, year-round rainfall, humid. It was close to coastal waters, so after it was being grown, easy to ship on or transfer onto the ships to be later shipped across the transatlantic. When Christopher Columbus returns from the Canary Islands after informing Queen Isabella of his discovery, he takes a sugarcane plant to Hispaniola in 1493. First successful large-scale sugar harvest happens 7 or 8 years later in 1501 in that same island, and then later on, first commercial success of sugar plantation or a sugar factory established in 1513. Essentially, Portuguese dominates the sugar industry. especially after the discovery of Brazil in 1500. So the thing with the Spanish, they struggled to compete with the Portuguese, and this was particularly due to Portuguese having access to better sugar technologies due to exchange of knowledge at the Cyprus and Crete and other Mediterranean islands that they were able to exchange information. And the Spanish were more particularly focused on the silver mines and Portuguese, and they were getting significant amount of wealth there. So while they cultivated a little bit in the sugar, the main driving force economically for Spain was silver, while Portuguese saw significant success in the sugar industry, and they become the first commercially successful empire. France, England, the Dutch established the sugar colonies in the Americas in conjunction with all these European countries essentially competing amongst one another when it comes to sugar, seeing how profitable this commodity is. And due to this, we start to see this plummet in sugar prices because it's starting to become integrated and available across the globe. African slave labor drives the price of sugar down throughout the world, becomes widely available. The average life expectancy of African slave labor force was up to 7 years, and because of the brutality that was faced while harvesting the sugar cane, because it was absolutely horrific and it was vigorous work. Sugar becomes part of our daily lives, where the average adult today consumes around 77 grams of sugar per day and 60 pounds per year. That's up to 4,000 pounds in a lifetime. Insane. Here's a little graph that gives you a little timeline. I made a mistake and I used the pound system because that's where I was basing my research prices on, but essentially 350 kilograms of sugar in 1300, that equates to around $470, $480 US. So the price of sugar, $3.68 a pound per kilogram, and what it is today comes out to around $4.50 exactly in this current currency in US dollar today. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you guys.
Now we have 3 minutes of Q&A.
Yeah. Yes, I give some time because I know you have some technical difficulties.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So.
Sorry about that, guys. Yeah, that was rather annoying, but.
Does anyone have any questions for the presenter?
Yeah. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, your graph of the price of sugar per kilogram, is that accounting for inflation or no?
Could you repeat that last part?
Is that accounting for inflation?
I believe so, actually. Yeah. I think I counted that, like, when I was doing my research. I was like, yeah, I should have counted, yeah. So, the brilliant question. Anybody else? Questions? Yeah?
So why did you pick to research this topic?
God, it's a very, so I grew fascinated by this topic by my two professors, Dr. Bond and Professor Sleeper. They introduced a brief history on sugar, and I was just fascinated because it's obviously a part of our everyday lives, and obviously there's a dark history, but also a history that wasn't so dark at a previous time, where it wasn't exactly slave labor, but there was working people who were, especially in ancient India, so I thought that was worth exploring and finding the history of such. And fun fact, my last name is Zucker, which in German is sugar. In German, yeah, so it was meant to be, I guess. So yeah. So yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great topic, and I'm just kind of curious, is there parts of your research that you didn't share with us that you'd like to expand on now?
Oh gosh, yeah, it was on that battle for time. That was definitely. Trying to think. God, I'm.
Did you look at how it changed diet or culture at all?
Yes. No. That's a yeah. So thank you for helping me. Yeah. So essentially, well, through the desserts and cuisine and so on, that essentially with the introduction of sugar with the cuisines that were created, that was essentially become the used for, even for example, molasses, that's used for particularly baking and used for brown sugar. So there's lots of different ways that sugar has been used in our foods, not just with dessert. So it definitely was a replacement where for a lot of the time we were using honey and dates. So once sugar became available, it was more easily accessible and so on, especially through the sugar trade. So you can kind of see this shift where it's like, why go to this when we can have sugar? And and so it just became this whole shape shift and such. So I think that's what drew my interest as well. So yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
Besides the, pardon me, besides the human cost, do you encounter any information about the dangers of shipping the product itself?
It's a good question. I didn't quite look into details. Thank you for I want to look into that. I want to look into, because I know with trade and cargo, there's obviously risks of piracy or pirates essentially. So that was probably one of the bigger dangers, because I know they didn't ship. I'm not too sure. Want to make sure if slaves were or indigenous people were shipped with the cargo, probably helping to unload that, which I could see possibility for so. But yeah, I want to look into that. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. Oh.
Oh, me?
I don't know. I heard someone say and. Yeah. Hey, yeah. Go.
You mentioned using the sugar to help people with diabetes. I was curious if it increased the lifespan of diabetics in the country.
Increase the lifespan of diabetes, like sugar itself.
Yeah.
Good question. Want to look more into that, because I didn't expound too much on like the exact specifically with diabetes and sugar pertaining to so. So that's a good question. I'd love to dive in. I'm gonna add those two into my mental notes. Yeah.
Yeah, due to the time limit, we will have the chat session at the end, so you can mingle with the presenter. So now we have to move on to